Dan Stulac, good to see you. Thank you for joining us. Yeah. So this is a little bit of a with marketing department. We're trying to get to know our professors a bit and show off, our programs here at the school. And there's students who are looking to figure out what they want to study, figure out where they fit in Briarcrest. And so wanted to talk to you a little bit. So tell us about yourself. Tell us about the program that you lead.
Background first?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I'm from the United States. I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri. I went to college in New Hampshire. Lived up there for about 10 years, and I lived, after that I lived abroad for a while in Rwanda. I was doing agricultural mission work in Rwanda for a couple of years.
Okay.
And then I came back to go to seminary. Went to seminary in New Jersey, and then wound up pursuing my doctorate in North Carolina at Duke Divinity School, Duke University and Divinity School. So, and I was there for 10 years, and then I came to Briarcrest in 2022.
So you've been here 4 years now. Tell us a little bit about your family. They're settling in here nice in Canada.
Yeah. We bought a house in Caronport, so we live right here in Caronport. My wife, Danielle, so Daniel and Danielle.
Oh, okay.
Very, very cute, very easy to keep track of us.
Yeah.
But my wife, Danielle, and I live right here in town. We have two daughters. Abigail is 6, almost 7, and Susanna just turned 5. So it's a great place to raise kids. They're safe and happy, and they run around in the meadow, and they go biking all around town, and have made a lot of friends here. So it's a really good place to have a young family and to raise children. So we've been enjoying that.
Girl dad. I'm a girl dad too.
Yeah.
It's amazing. I don't know. I think you always want a boy, and I want to play sports with my kid, and then now I have girls. I'm like, I just want girls. They're so sweet.
I didn't care one way or the other. I'm delighted by my children. So,
yeah. Tell me about Rwanda. That's an interesting stop along the journey. So 2 years. What is agricultural ministry?
Yeah. Well, my sister was actually is a doctor, and she was doing sort of medical work over there in a rural, very impoverished corner of Rwanda. And so I went there to build an agriculture assistance program in association with a hospital. So we sort of built a resource farm and worked alongside numerous Rwandans to sort of experiment with new crops and vegetables and that sort of thing, and then help individual families that were struggling with HIV and malnutrition to make improvements at their homes. So to build small gardens or micro enterprises like a passion fruit small passion fruit farm that would be able to generate enough fruit to pay for the kids to go to school or that sort of thing.
So they can take that to the market and they can sell.
Yeah, exactly. Or a pineapple farm, or and be introducing some of these agricultural products and resources that they didn't wouldn't automatically have access to. So.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Cool. So then that takes you you do that for a bit, you want to get back into seminary. What was the draw like?
Yeah, I always knew I was going to go back to seminary. I was an English and creative writing major in college, so I didn't study religion in college. I didn't study Bible in college. I studied literature and language. And I always knew that at some point after college, I was going to go back to school, primarily for Bible and primarily for Greek and Hebrew. I just knew that I wanted to learn the biblical languages, and that would be, Bible was deep in my soul. It was a hugely important part of my relationship with God, and I wanted to be able to read the Bible in the original languages. I thought that would be an extremely meaningful, intellectual, academic, and also devotional pursuit.
Yeah.
But I also, I had some other things I wanted to do first, because I knew that when I went back to school to go to seminary, I was probably going to stay in school and then wind up sort of moving from there into career. And so I took some time away from college, between college and seminary, to go do some other things. Went to Rwanda, did some other things, but always knew I was headed back to school. So I went to seminary not knowing whether I was bound for the mission field or whether I was going to become a pastor or whether I was going to stay in academia. Came back from Rwanda, started seminary, took my first Hebrew class, fell madly in love with Hebrew and biblical languages. And it was a 3-year program, it was a 3-year MDiv. And I would say after my first year, I would say that I knew I wanted to stay in academia, that of those sort of vocational directions, going back to the mission field or becoming a congregational minister or staying in the classroom. it became apparent. There's a lot of vocational discernment that happens in seminary, and it became apparent to me that my vocational gifts, my pastoral gifts, were better suited to the classroom than they were to congregational ministry. So I decided to pursue a PhD, pursue a doctorate, so that I could be a professor, so that I could do the kind of work that I'm doing now at Briarcrest.
We clearly latched on to something that made you very curious. And so then you like just follow that as far as you can. Because I've heard that like when you're thinking about PhD or any of those like, master's is one thing, but then like beyond that, so you got to find something that like you will devote 4 years nonstop study to and like you're not bored of.
Yeah, I always say for potential PhD students, doctoral students, I always say you've got to find something. You got to make sure that your project is something that gets you out of bed in the morning, regardless of career or job or anything else, because there's days when you're going to have to get out of bed in the morning and work on it, whether you want to or not. So you better make sure that it's something that you are passionately interested in. And so that was true for me. I wound up at Duke to study specifically with a woman named Ellen Davis, and in Old Testament, and I wound up working on the book of Isaiah. So I spent a solid 3 years of my life struggling to understand the book of Isaiah, which is 66 chapters long and full of complicated Hebrew. So I grew in just all different kinds of ways, but I certainly grew in my ability to read and understand and vocalize the Hebrew language, and also in my understanding of text and understanding of biblical theology. All of those things sort of deepened in the course of my PhD. Yeah.
It seems to me, and one thing I've noticed is oftentimes people will gravitate towards, like once you're in that academic train, it's really Old Testament or really New Testament. For you, why Old Testament? Was it just, you're like, you found yourself in that stream, and you're like, I love it, I'm going to keep going?
Yeah, that's a great question. And a full answer to that brings in my whole life story. But in a nutshell, or to maybe be as succinct as I can about it, my father was a pastor. So I always joke that I grew up going to church 6 days a week and taking one off instead of the other way around. And, we were the weird family that was memorizing, various Bible passages around the dinner table at night. And I was the weird kid at public school who was trying to engage my totally secular friends in questions like, what do you think about Ahab and Jezebel? And there's just sailing over there. They're like, what are you talking about, you weird kid? But it was in my bones from a really early age. And Old Testament stories, I read my picture Bible until it fell apart when I was 10 years old. And then as you heard a bit of my academic trajectory, but I wound up at seminary, and I remember sitting in my first semester introduction to the Old Testament class. It was it's a basic intro course that all seminarians would take, and we offer something like that at Briarcrest for like all freshmen take an introduction to Old Testament course that I now teach, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a kind of survey, it's an overview of the Old Testament. And I just remember sitting in that class and hearing my classmates ask questions of the professor. And it's not that they were bad questions, it's not that they were stupid questions, but I was startled by, for some people who were just as passionate for the content, they were passionate for Jesus just as much as I was, but they obviously hadn't grown up steeped in biblical literature and in Old Testament. And I listened to the professor answer those students, and I realized, if I become a pastor of a single congregation, I can have a ministry in that particular context, and that would be really rewarding and valuable. But that guy is training hundreds and hundreds of future pastors to interpret Scripture for hundreds and hundreds of other congregations. I want that guy's job. So that was really exciting and appealing to me. I realized, the way that I want to contribute to the church, the way that I want to serve, I want to do it in the classroom, and particularly through Old Testament, because I felt like I've been given sort of access and an experience with the Old Testament that was unusual from a very young age, and that the Old Testament made sense to me in maybe ways that it didn't make sense to some of my classmates. But it's such, I mean, it's as I'm fond of saying in my own classrooms with my own students here at Briarcrest, you can't understand a lick of the New Testament without understanding how it is rooted, sort of tethered to, grounded in the Old Testament. The Old Testament is the mental furniture of the New Testament. How are you going to understand what Jesus is doing in the New Testament apart from the book of Leviticus? How are you going to understand what is happening in the book of Acts apart from the concept of promised land? How are you going to understand what Paul is talking about with respect to the body apart from the book of Numbers and the censuses that are taken in the Old Testament? Look, the mental furniture of the New is the Old Testament. So I wanted to be able to sort of deliver that to the church more broadly.
Yeah, and then begin to make those connections in those students, which will only reinforce their love of the New Testament once they see the...
Exactly. So the field of biblical studies certainly does separate Old Testament from New Testament. You kind of have to choose, are you going to get a degree in Old Testament or a degree in New Testament?
And is that because of the language? Like, because you tend to focus more on the Greek?
And there's a whole set of additional scholarly questions that have to be asked that are different for Old Testament than they are from New Testament. But that said, the whole time I was in school, I tried to get to know my New Testament counterparts. I tried to take classes from those professors. I did take those classes, and developed robust relationships sort of across the Testaments. And that's really important to how I teach Old Testament today. What I think I'm doing when I'm teaching Old Testament is I am hoping that my students will learn to appreciate the literature so that they'll appreciate its theology, and ultimately that they'll see that theology filled up in the person of Jesus and in the incarnation of the Old Testament God, and that there's a sort of formal distinction between the Testaments, but there is not a theological distinction in terms of how God relates to his people through grace throughout the entirety of Scripture. So that's how I approach the classroom. It's what I think I'm doing and what I'm hoping my students will catch wind of. And I always say of my New Testament colleagues here at Briarcrest, I think I'm teaching my students to take their classes, and I hope that they're also teaching their students that they won't get very far in their classes without taking my classes. That it all goes together.
So students thinking about biblical studies, what does that look like for them? They apply, they're in. Now what can they expect in your program?
Well, all students, as part of the general education requirement at Briarcrest, all students will wind up in BLST 111, which is the Introduction to Old Testament class, and I teach 2 sections of this every fall. So it's not a small class, but it's not overly large. So usually between 35 to 45 students, right? Required class, general education, all students take, and it's a survey of the Old Testament. We don't cover every book, but it's a kind of hooking in, places to kind of hook in to the literature and a broad perspective on what the Old Testament is about. And then all students will also wind up in BLST 109, which is the Introduction to the New Testament. So you'll get an experience with the whole Bible, right? Should a student choose to major, become a 4-year major in Bible, they're going to be taking, off the top of my head, I don't remember the exact number of classes, but you're going to wind up taking a variety of other 200 and 300 level classes. So 200 level courses are typically surveys. So, for example, I'm teaching a 200 level survey on the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Old Testament, first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So you can sort of see at a 200 level, we're no longer dealing with a survey of the entire Old Testament. We've kind of localized, but we're still dealing with 5 books. In a 15-week term, we're really only covering, we've got about 3 weeks to deal with Genesis, 3 weeks to deal with Exodus, right? At the 300 level, you'll also take a variety of 300 level courses, and these courses tend to be book studies.
Right.
So I'm teaching a 300 level course on Judges right now. Last term, I taught a 300 level course on the book of Isaiah.
Oh, wow.
One whole class focused on all 66 chapters of Isaiah. And then in the New Testament department, you'll get book studies on John or Romans or Revelation, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Within the sort of 200 level surveys and the 300 level book studies, We also we offer a couple of sort of background classes and also hermeneutic classes, or classes on hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is just a sort of fancy word for interpretation, strategies for interpretation. And then we also offer these background classes, sort of. Professor Miller, for example, teaches Jewish backgrounds to give you some context for the New Testament, sort of setting the text within its sort of cultural and historical setting to help you understand what is going on in Jesus's world. The hermeneutics classes are really, really important. There is an optional 200 level course for majors in hermeneutics. Again, this is the reason these courses are so important is that they help you to take a step back from the Bible and ask yourself the question, not what's in there, but rather, how do I begin, how do I approach the text on the front end? What is the text? Yeah. What is a viable way of reading the text? Are there differences in the ways that people read texts? Are some maybe more profitable or more helpful than other ways of reading the text? So there's a 200 level course for that. There's also a required 400 level course in hermeneutics that all Briarcrest Bible majors take. It's called Advanced Hermeneutics. Okay. And we look at the history of biblical interpretation, and we critically and charitably evaluate a number of different strategies that are typical of modern biblical studies in the present, but all majors take that. And then finally, all majors take a 400 level capstone seminar. This will be a small class, maybe 5, 6, 7 students focused on a topic or a specific biblical book, doing an in-depth study, doing perhaps a research paper likely will be associated with it. And you'll really be prepared when you go through that experience. You'll be well prepared to go on and do work at the master's level or beyond.
What have some of your students chosen for their capstone projects?
So I taught the first capstone seminar. I teach every 2 years. I teach advanced hermeneutics. Okay. And then 2 years ago, I taught a capstone seminar on the Elijah and Elisha narratives. Yeah. I wrote a book some years ago called Life, Land, and Elijah in the Book of Kings. Yeah. So it's about the stories about the prophets that are sort of seated right in the middle of the overall books of 1st and 2nd Kings together. It begins with Solomon and ends with exile. And right in the middle, we have this whole sort of package of stories about these charismatic figures, Elijah and Elisha. And so we did a sort of deep study of those stories, reading chapter by chapter, and reading a variety of secondary literature, commentaries, and articles about how people interpret those characters.
Biggest hermeneutical mistakes people are making when looking at those books? What would you say, as you look around, because you're probably reading other interpretations and maybe even other academics, but be brutal about it, cutthroat. What are they getting wrong?
So my answer to that applies generally to Old Testament studies. I think many students have been led to believe that the Old Testament is bad news, right? And that Jesus saves us from the Old Testament, right? Or maybe if you were to say the same thing in a somewhat less extreme way, I think many students at the very least are uncomfortable or maybe have some misgivings with the God of the Old Testament. Right. And in order to salvage the Old Testament, many incoming students believe that perhaps the best way to go about that is to dabble and kind of cherry pick a variety of stories from the Old Testament that seem to suggest maybe like a hero of the faith, somebody that does the right thing. And maybe I could be like that person too, or maybe I should be like that person. Right. So the Old Testament comes to be a kind of repository of moral faith lessons, tales from the past that suggest to Daniel Markin that he should be a good boy this week.
I literally was just I just heard a sermon on you have lots of Goliaths in your life, but you can be like David, and you can, from this past weekend, it's and that to me, I'm wait a minute, this seems like there's probably way more going on than just an eisegetical, making it about you, the individual.
So I when I teach the Old Testament, I begin with the assumption that the Old Testament is good news.
Yep.
That the Old Testament is theology, it's literature, it's theology, and its theology is saturated with grace from the very beginning. Right? And so as students encounter whole biblical books in my class, I'm going to introduce them to what those whole biblical books have been designed to do. So for example, in the story of Elijah and Elisha, those two stories, or those sets of stories, sit within the books of 1st and 2nd Kings. Well, the books of 1st and 2nd Kings are part of a kind of unit within the Old Testament called the former prophets. Now, they're narrative books, but these books of the Bible function like prophecy in the lives of the reader.
Right.
Well, what does prophecy do? Prophecy isn't clairvoyance, like what's going to happen in the future. There's a future orientation to prophecy, but prophetic literature, whether it's narrative prophetic literature or whether it's poetic prophetic literature, is transformative truth-telling.
Wow.
It tells the truth. It's not always fun to hear the truth. None of us likes to be indicted for our sin. None of us likes to be told that we have a problem, right? That we're sick, as the book of Isaiah says, chapter 1, verse 5, that you're sick from the top of your head to the bottom of your feet, right? No one likes that. That's not a fun thing to encounter, right? But whether it's narrative or whether it's poetry, biblical prophetic literature indicts the reader for the purpose of that reader's ultimate transformation.
Right.
Right? So the stories that we find in the former prophets, they're not there to sort of cajole you into striving harder this week to be a better boy or a better girl. They are there to show you who God is, and they're there to break your heart for the sin of the human condition, for the problem of the human condition. They're there to break your heart. And when you come to the end of yourself, when you realize what the human condition is all about, and you really come to the end of your own striving, you'll be transformed into the kind of person that Deuteronomy anticipates, a person whose heart is open to transformation. We call that heart circumcision in the end of the book of Deuteronomy. The prophetic literature in the Old Testament is responsible to that idea and designed to affect that inside the reader, right? Jesus taught that in his Sermon on the Mount, and he is that as the fulfillment of all of that literature, as the sort of filling up. Imagine water pouring from a pitcher into a cup. That's Jesus being poured into the Old Testament. He is the filling up of Old Testament discourse and theology.
Yeah, he teaches, he slaughters the reader, and they're like, oh, and then he's like, I am the answer, right in front of you. I remember, I think that's a common misconception. I think a lot of, young people in our faith, you go through this, you're 18, you're leaving your maybe safe evangelical church, and you're now trying to take the Bible seriously. Look at the Old Testament, and the common claim is God's a monster. Because they struggle with God being violent. I grew up Mennonite Brethren denomination. So a big emphasis on pacifism and nonviolence and stuff, which is good. But what do you do with the fact that you see God as a God of war and asking, telling the people of Israel, go conquer and judge these people? If they made a movie of the Bible, right? And if they truthfully made the rating on it would just be off the charts. It'd be
it's an R-rated book, and it is. And in all seriousness, it's a really complicated question. As in trying to understand why the Bible, why the Old Testament speaks in the language of militarism. Especially if in the New Testament, if we're followers of Jesus, we're going to love our enemies and we're going to turn the other cheek, et cetera, right? Why is it that Jesus teaches us to behave in such a way that is different than the way that numerous characters in the Old Testament behave? That's a really important question. It's a complicated question that probably doesn't fit totally within the space of this interview. But that's the kind of question that I would like to see young Christians ask and dive into seriously and investigate for themselves. And that's precisely what a biblical education at a place like Briarcrest within the Bible department, like going deep within this field in particular, you're going to get a taste of the answers to that question, or some potentially helpful answers to that question in BLST 111 when we deal with the book of Joshua. But we only spend one day on the book of Joshua in BLST 111. There's only so far down you can go, right? But within the Bible major, you have the opportunity to take, for example, a whole course on the book of Judges, which I'm teaching right now, which is chock full of atrocities, right? Chock full of all sorts of things that I would not recommend that you replicate in the world today. Why is that? And can we still read these texts as Christian scripture? These are really, really important questions that I think a lot of students have found deeply rewarding to pursue in depth in small classes, through one-on-one conversations with professors at the school. It's one of the strong suits of our biblical and Bible and theology department.
Well, and to that point, like I've dropped in your office and I've just asked you theology questions and hermeneutical questions and things like that. And that's open for the students. They can come sit with you, and that's just, they're not going to get that at major, huge schools. Like, you're going to be a barn of 400 people. You maybe have a TA teaching you. You see a professor once in a while. But that interaction, I think, is
the chance to have a one-on-one relationship with your professor. I mean, I go to the dining hall, the CAF, and have lunch with students all the time. And sometimes I initiate. Sometimes students just come up to me after BLST 111 and say, you just gave this lecture on the book of Judges, or we just dealt with this thing in Isaiah. I'm still struggling with it. Can I pick your brain for another hour? I just have all these questions. Sure, let's go to have lunch in the CAF together. And you can ask me all the questions you want. And students do have access to the professors in that way. And I think that has been a really meaningful dimension of our program.
Well, and that's one of the things I love about Christianity is, to all those questions, I've found it the case, if you're willing to put in the time and effort to find the answers, there's always deeply satisfying answers to them. They just don't come instantly. They take a long time, takes work, takes wrestling, right? You wrote a few books. I'd love to let's just do a quick overview and look at some of these, because my understanding is you've just kind of finished a 3-part series. Is there more to this part with some of these companions?
No, the series is over. Should I start at the beginning? I don't know how deep we want to go here, but
we'll do an overview and then we can jump in.
I'll hand them to you. You can hold them up. This is my dissertation. It's called History and Hope. So this was my project when I was in school for my doctorate. History and Hope: The Agrarian Wisdom of Isaiah 28 through 35. It is a deep study with an unattractive cover. It is a deep study of 8 chapters from the middle of the book of Isaiah, and it is a library book. It's not the type of book that lots of people buy or lots of people read, but my colleagues within the field hopefully may read it. After that, I wrote a second library book. Again, not a book that loads and loads of people read, but scholarship, but kind of a book that winds up as part of an Old Testament series. Yeah, it's like a reference book. It's called Life, Land, and Elijah in the Book of Kings. Again, glorious, attractive cover. But my senior seminar, 400 level seminar, is based off that book, and I actually do assign that book as required reading in my senior seminar, and we work through it at the same time that we work through text, and we really go deeply into strategies of interpretation for those stories. More recently, so these are academic books. These are written for scholars. They're written for my colleagues.
Great.
More recently, I've produced a 3-part series with Cascade Publishing House in Oregon. A 3-part series based on the books of Judges, 1 Samuel, and 2 Samuel. And 3 books. The first one is called Gift of the Grotesque, a Christological companion to the book of Judges. And then the second one is...
what a title. Because you would... When is something grotesque a gift, right? And I think that's... it's powerful.
Yeah, Judges is such such a difficult read, because there's so much tragedy and there are so many atrocities, and I really began to wonder. I had my research for this book on Kings had me in Deuteronomy through Kings. I was sort of reading Deuteronomy through Kings on a loop for about a year, every month or so. I was just like cycling through this material. And so I was reading through Judges. I wound up writing that book about the prophetic stories in Kings, of course, but I had read through Judges and the Samuels over and over and over again. And in the course of that study for that book, lingering in the back of my head was this question of tragedy. The book of Judges is a tragedy. It winds up in civil war. Brutality, dismemberment, civil war, kidnapping. How is this Christian scripture, right? What?
How are these God's people?
What rhetorical effect is this book designed to have on me as a reader, right? I became sort of captivated by that question and the sort of challenge and possibilities of reading the book of Judges as Christian scripture, reading it in such a way that I could take seriously its literary form, be completely honest with what I was reading on the page, and yet also see in it a window into the new. And so that's why the subtitle of that book, Gift of the Grotesque, the subtitle is A Christological Companion to the Book of Judges. Mm-hmm. It's not a commentary, but it is a companion to sort of sit alongside your experience with the biblical text in such a way that you would possibly see a little bit more about who Jesus is, especially insofar as Jesus suffers atrocity, suffers the barbarism that is sort of being worked out in the book of Judges. So I wrote that book and then I followed it up. I sort of created a trilogy out of it. And the second book is called Tragedy of the Commons, a Christological Companion to the book of 1 Samuel. And the third, which I've just recently completed, is called Worship and Waste, a Christological Companion to the book of 2 Samuel. Yep. Again, not commentaries, but companions alongside your study of the biblical text. My hope is that anyone that reads these books, if you're reading Gift of the Grotesque alongside Judges, that you would be led back to Judges, that you would want to read Judges, and that in reading Judges you would get some sort of profitable guidance from this book on how to interpret such a difficult book in light of Christ.
And then through it, love Christ more.
Exactly.
Of who he is.
Yeah.
What is it like in particular of the book of Judges that breaks your heart? Like I mean,
every word.
List,
I mean,
think of the college student. Think of
the way that I describe the book of Judges is that it's a theological dark age. I mean, we all know, but the medieval, the dark ages, which were not nearly as dark as people think. But the idea, I think, of a dark age is something that people have in their head, where sort of classical civilization has sort of broken down. There's a lot of people migrating through Northern Europe, and some of the institutions are being swept away, and some of the centers of learning are being destroyed, etc. The book of Judges is a theological dark age. It's a sort of moment in Israel's memory when the people's relationship with God, their sort of idea of God and their connection with God becomes occluded and mixed up and inverted, right? So virtually everything that can go wrong in Israel goes wrong in the book of Judges. The question, or the sort of mystery of the book, or the challenge of the book, is within a world that is totally flipped upside down and inside out, that has gone haywire on every level, there's a series of salvation stories. Even there, even in the heart of Israel's theological dark age, even there's a pattern of salvation and rescue. And every time you encounter one of these salvation stories, you learn a little bit more about who God is and what it means to be rescued by that God. And strung together in a line, as dark as the book of Judges is, and as sort of catastrophic as it is, there's a pattern of salvation that's sort of woven through the darkness. And that's true of all 5 of the tragic prophetic narratives that are found in the Old Testament: Judges, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, and 2 Kings. The books of 1 and 2 Kings, for instance, they begin with Solomon and they end in exile. Right. I mean, it's a downward catastrophe. Yep. It's a train wreck when you get to the end of 2 Kings. Yep. Complete train wreck. And yet, the people that wrote those books figured out how to tell the story of the very worst thing that has ever happened to Israel in such a way that a reader who is reading through this material and whose heart is breaking for the disaster that is currently unfolding is also learning about a pattern of resurrection, so that that reader, he or she, would expect God to raise the dead on the far side of that catastrophe. I think that's pretty remarkable. Just in terms of literature, I just think it's remarkable that Israel figured out how to tell the story of the worst thing that's ever happened to it in such a way that the reader would read it and expect on the far side of catastrophe resurrection. If you think about the worst thing that's ever happened to you, and imagine narrating that story to someone in such a way that he or she would sort of catch wind of all of the disaster and think to him or herself, I think Daniel's come back to life after this. I think that's remarkable.
That is. So what would you say is really unique about the way Briarcrest teaches and then like walks a student through Old Testament, for example, languages?
Or a Bible or a Bible degree in general. So Briarcrest has got a absolutely unique way of approaching biblical languages, and this is sort of central to what we're doing in the Bible and theology department. All four-year majors in Bible at Briarcrest are required to take a biblical language. And that's 4 semesters of either Hebrew or Greek, and you're welcome to take more. Both languages offer additional semesters on top of that, a 5th semester of Hebrew or a 5th and 6th semester, even a 7th semester of biblical Greek. And there are lots of schools that teach biblical languages. But as far as I know, we're the only place in Canada that teaches biblical languages as living languages. So we teach both biblical Hebrew and biblical Greek on the communicative model. So when you come, what this means functionally is that when you come to class on the first day, or I could back up and say, when I learned Hebrew for the very first time, and I came to class on the first day, I had in hand a grammar textbook. And that textbook contained all sorts of rules about how the language works, and here's the alphabet, and here's how it works, and here are the rules, the grammatical rules, and please memorize this book, right? And that was my Hebrew education. And unsurprisingly, of the 45 or so people that were in that class with me in seminary, those of us that still read Hebrew and read it well is probably a pretty low number. That's a terrible way to learn a language. We're not built for it. Human beings are not built to absorb language through grammatical rules out of a textbook. We learn it organically. We learn it by connecting with other human beings who are using that language. The same way that my daughters learn English, and actually my daughters learn Hebrew right now because I teach them Hebrew. Spoken Hebrew, right? We learn it through interaction, through games. So we teach both Hebrew and Greek at Briarcrest on the living language model. And that means that when you come to class, you do not come with a textbook in hand. You come on the first day, and I spend about 20 minutes going over the syllabus. And I stop and say, and now it is time to begin our Hebrew education. And I begin speaking Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, with you. And I ask you something really simple. I say something like, Shemi Daniel ma shemacha. My name's Daniel. What is your name? Right? And you don't know what that means at first, but little by little, you kind of pick it up after a couple minutes of me going around the room. Oh, he's asking me my name, right? And you learn to respond in Hebrew. And we go from there, word by word, phrase by phrase, grammatical rule by grammatical rule. We begin to build upward from there. And this is a really, really fun, really engaging way to learn any language, but in particular with biblical languages, this mode of language education helps the language to sort of drop from your brain into your belly, like it goes into your gut, and students are really able to use it, right? Over the course of 4 semesters, you play loads of games in the classroom. So like a typical day in the classroom, we'll be going around the room, doing some listen and repeat. Then we'll all get up. We might act out a Bible story. I've got swords and props and fruit and baskets, and we're throwing things around the room. I've got this stuffed horse, and so lots of props and dolls, and we act out Bible stories. We read text on the screen. We do a lot of pictures. You go home. Your homework is not to memorize rules out of a book, but rather to look at maybe 100 pictures, and then a voice will say what it is, and then you say it out loud again. So students find this really, really fun, really rewarding, and honestly, you're just able to do so much more with it. So in 4 semesters of Hebrew, you wind up reading the books of Jonah and Ruth, a few Psalms, various portions of 1 Samuel, and some other texts as well. And you go out of 4 semesters of Hebrew able to pick up the Old Testament and read it in Hebrew and vocalize it in Hebrew and understand it with the help of a dictionary and some other guides. Like you're really able to use it and read it for the rest of your life.
Yeah. And you always have that. You can always take that with you. You're sitting in church and you're reading through it.
Yeah. So again, we're the only place in Canada that is teaching biblical languages in this way. It's a sort of hallmark of our biblical studies education, and it gives you access to Scripture in an incredibly meaningful, deep way that you'll be able to use for the rest of your life. Whether you go into a profession like pastoral ministry, or whether you stay in academia, or whether you go into any other profession, you're going to have access to Scripture in that profession and in your personal life forever.